Puthoff and Swan eventually agreed to collaborate on an 8-month-long series of more carefully constructed experiments, which would eventually become the basis of Project SCANATE. These initial legitimate experiments were more or less elaborate versions of the previous guess the item in the box, such as identifying basic features of photographs placed in sealed envelopes, predicting the color of lasers being used in a remote lab, and determining which small canister from a group contained a fragment of radioactive material. As time went on, Swan vocalized his dissatisfaction with the whole endeavor, finding the process tedious and a poor reflection of his abilities, going so far as to suggest he be given a pair of earthly horizontal coordinates and simply remotely view the location. Puthoff, now joined by Russell Targ, initially rejected the idea, but conceded a break in the monotony might do everyone some good. As per Ingo Swan's suggestion, these newer experiments involved the selection by Targ of several locations on a world map, and the relaying of each location's latitude and longitude to Swan and Puthoff, who awaited in an adjacent laboratory. 10 random locations were compiled at a time, and 10 remote viewing sessions were ultimately performed for a total of 100 attempts. Each session would take about 20 minutes, and all target locations were kept secret until each corresponding session was completed. The results of the last of these sessions was published within MindReach, an impressive set of data that, on the surface, seems statistically significant, with no less than 7 targets evaluated as psychic hits, though this is a matter of debate. In one response, Swan notes, "Ocean, beautiful blue-green waves, shining, ship toward north." At the corresponding latitude, there is about a 40 to 50% chance of guessing land or ocean, not terrible odds. Other, granular details, such as the ship and the color of the waves, are not verifiable and are effectively meaningless. In another, Swan sees open water and stands of pines to the north. The location in question is in the middle of Hudson Bay. While the guess for water is again not that remarkable considering the substance covers a majority of the Earth's surface, the only stands of pine Swan would be able to see would be hundreds of miles distant. In fact, the areas to the north of the site lie far above the edge of the Canadian boreal forest and would likely only contain scrub brush and grasses. Again, Swan is given a hit by simply stating mountains. This time he is viewing southern Mongolia, which is indeed covered with mountains. However, there are a few places on Earth where one is more than a few hundred miles from mountains, even in the middle of the ocean, as one could easily argue. To be fair, some of Swan's responses are genuinely strange. Volcano to southwest, I think I'm over ocean, is a passable description of Mount Hekla in Iceland. Sense of speeding over water, landing on land, lake to west, high elevation, is weirdly reminiscent of the southeastern shore of Lake Victoria. Taken aback by what they perceived as a new promising avenue of research, Puthoff and Targ expanded the scope of the coordinate viewing to include more verifiable specificity, such as buildings and bridges, and architectural features. Special care was taken to minimize the possibility of giving Swan subliminal cues, and Puthoff, Targ, and Swan were all kept ignorant of location details until the end of each session. Target locations were first submitted by other, often skeptical, SRI staff members, and later by interested researchers at other institutes, the targets and associated details becoming more complex. A notable example is found within the set of coordinates received at the SRI via telephone. Swan was asked for an immediate reply. Quote, "My initial response is that it's an island, maybe a mountain sticking up through a cloud cover. Terrain seems rocky, must be some sort of small plants growing there. Cloud bank to the west, very cold. I see some buildings rather mathematically laid out. One of them is orange. There's something like a radar antenna, a round disc. 2 white cylindrical tanks, quite large. To the northwest, a small airstrip. Wind is blowing. Must be 2 or 3 trucks in front of building. Behind, is that an outhouse? There's not much there." Unquote. As Swan continued his narrative, he sketched an annotated map for reference. The narrative begins here. Here he notes rocks sticking out of the ocean, with waves breaking. At this point, he claims to see a cluster of buildings and a small wharf with a number of moored boats. He notes a jetty of land. A copse of trees at this point, and a noticeably straight coastline and a snow-capped mountain rising in the background. A basin of sand cut through by a river, with a number of birds visible. An irregular area. A high cliff here. A promontory here. This area has large breakers. A bay can be found here. Another group of buildings, possibly a lighthouse, and an airstrip can be found at this location. The actual location was in fact Kerguelen Island, a remote French-administered island that, at the time of Swann's viewing, was the center of a joint Franco-Soviet geophysical research operation. The island is known for its ruggedness and extremely uneven coastline, similar to the finger-like fjords found in Scandinavia. Admittedly, there are similarities between Swann's viewing and objective reality, though one would be hard-pressed to classify these as anything other than vague. It is very possible Swann was familiar enough with the Earth's surface to place the given coordinates within the Indian Ocean, which would mean he was probably asked to view an island of some type. And while it is undeniably certain many natural features of Swann's map echo their real-world counterparts, many unrelated maps have self-similarity. Middle-earth shares many features with the area surrounding Los Angeles, but this doesn't mean J.R.R. Tolkien had psychic visions of Redondo Beach. As far as a lucky guess, artificial structures such as buildings and a radar dish are not beyond reason, as they are rather basic indications of human habitation, as is an airstrip and wharf, as there has to be some way of getting to and fro, although the island did have an airstrip during the period in question, and several locations around the coast have excellent anchorage. On May 29, 1973, Puthoff was asked by CIA contract monitor Kit Green to relay another set of coordinates to a target location in West Virginia. This site was a classified site used by the National Security Agency, or the NSA. For obvious reasons, maps were not allowed, and coordinates were not permitted to be disclosed to the public. Researchers at the SRI would be kept in the dark as to the accuracy of Swann's statements, although they would be evaluated by intelligence services. Swann's response was similar in detail to that given to Kerguelen Island, including a quick sketch of the location to use as a reference. A summary of the analysis was later issued. Quote, "The data exceed any possible bounds of coincidental correlation, and exceed any possible bounds of acquisition by known means." Unquote. A bold and telling statement indeed, and if taken at face value, gives the subject of remote viewing specifically, and psychic powers in general, a sudden air of respectability. Certainly this was something that was worth looking into. But one hit, no matter how impressive, is not enough to change scientific paradigms by itself. Swann or others had to repeat such achievements again and again at will. Interested parties at the CIA, Puthoff, and even Swann may have been fooling themselves into seeing things that aren't actually true, giving weight to things that are routine and unremarkable in any other context. How exactly does a remote viewer locate a horizontal coordinate? Convenient though it may be, the system of latitude and longitude used by terrestrial navigators is an entirely artificial construct. Even something as abstract and man-made as the base 10 numerical system has more connection to the natural world, as any integer of reasonable day-to-day use has a direct one-to-one correspondence with a quantity of objects. Presumably, psychic abilities are natural and innate, at least for talented individuals, and must therefore have come about by natural means. Assuming this means some long-term process of biological selection, how can an ability evolve naturally that utilizes a completely invented contrivance? Swann himself attempted to explain away this issue using a rather interesting bit of homegrown logic. Quote, Swann argues that remote viewing, which is a task in mental space, is directed toward the description of a location in the physical universe, and therefore requires an impedance bridging, which partakes of both the mental and physical realms. Unquote. In other words, even though they are totally artificial, coordinates occupy a mental space, but have great meaning in physical space, and therefore act as a bridge between the two. How parallels and meridians drawn on a globe become real and stay perfectly consistent between two viewers is never explained by Swann or anyone else. Of course, the seemingly mysterious utility of coordinates could also be explained by a remote viewer like Swann simply having a good working knowledge of the surface of the Earth and the associated coordinates, and then using this knowledge in conjunction with his paranormal talent. But such an explanation would only serve to nullify said talent. Essentially, a person who knew enough about latitude and longitude to understand their context in relation to the surface of the Earth would know enough to give reasonably accurate answers to what they might see when remotely traveling to the coordinates in question. For example, if before an experimental session, a remote viewer already knows that 40 degrees west and 80 degrees north is in the middle of Greenland, when asked to remotely view these coordinates, they would undoubtedly describe a vast treeless wasteland of ice. If the viewer admitted possessing such geographic knowledge beforehand, even the most credulous researcher would not think such a description was the result of clairvoyance. Of course, calling out a specious quality of some of the SRI's experiments doesn't negate the possibility of remote viewing, though it might ultimately make the whole subject less useful, as it might not be any better than simply studying a map. Furthermore, why does remote viewing seem to be restricted to the surface of the Earth? Why not give Ingo Swann a set of random lunar coordinates and compare his descriptions with known surface features? Why not explore the surface of Mars or Venus? There seems to be little danger to the viewer from harsh environments. Any claims could be confirmed at a future time, even a far future time. On April 27th of 1973, at the suggestion of Ingo Swann, Puthoff and Targ agreed to observe and record the remote viewing of the planet Jupiter as simultaneously performed by Swann himself at the SRI and a man named Harold Sherman of Mountain View, Arkansas. Mr. Sherman was a noted psychic researcher, paranormal author, and self-professed remote viewer that had become acquainted with Swann in late 1972. The intent was to remotely observe the giant planet and its major moons before the arrival of Pioneer 10, an unmanned probe scheduled to begin a flyby of the Jovian system during the following November. If Swann and Sherman obtained similar results, and if those results were accurate when compared to the telemetry of the Pioneer 10 probe, the idea of remote viewing would gain a substantial amount of credibility. The following is taken from the transcripts of both Ingo Swann and Harold Sherman during their joint remote viewing. The experiment began at precisely 6 p.m. Pacific time, Swann at a lab at SRI, and Sherman at his house 1,900 miles to the east in Mountain View, Arkansas. The experiment was to last for 30 minutes, after which time Swann would call Sherman to compare notes. It is now 8 p.m. Central Standard Time, and I am sitting in my special concentration room in the little house where Ingo Swann stayed when he visited us some weeks ago. As I prepare to direct my consciousness to the attempted probe of Jupiter, its occurrences and conditions relative thereto, I am immediately and associatively sucked into total contact with a speeding space module, Pioneer 10, and I can clearly see that it is at present traveling on a definite collision course with one of the largest Jupiter moons, and unless this course is ultimately altered, it will most certainly crash into it and end its investigative journey. Now I am carried ahead of it and am approaching the Jupiter moon itself. It seems larger than Earth, a great shiny revolving ball surrounded by a gigantic swirl of gases, giving off a golden glow and crystal-like diamond sparkles and unbelievable inner sight. I am still some distance from Jupiter, which I can see to the right of this moon, far, far away. 1 million, I can't tell, perhaps more. Anyway, a great many miles distant, and with an almost eye-blinding brilliance that is radiating. I'm sure that physical eyesight could not stand what I am perceiving inwardly. I seem to be a speck, a particle somehow free of the gravitational pull which is affecting everything around me. I am able to see in all directions as I mentally look around. It is as though I am looking through a scope, seeing all this in miniature, and suddenly magnified into a normal size. The sensation comes and goes. These visions are inside me, then outside. There is a yellow cast to space, and seeming dark objects show through it. Can they be other moons of contrasting colors or densities? The impressions come to me that there are 17, some yet undiscovered by Earth scientists, much closer to Jupiter, and the feeling also comes that some of them have been and are being spawned by the convulsive volcanic action in the interior of the gaseous masses of Jupiter, spun off into space in newly forming vortices, which start a revolution of their own, gathering inconceivable gaseous forces and electronic particles to them, which adhere to these newly created masses and ultimately solidify in the new moons. The feeling also comes that the sun originally, an unthinkably huge gaseous mass, in a mighty explosion threw off vast gaseous balls which began the planets we recognize today, including Jupiter. all ultimately achieving a gravitational balance in time and place. And in the process of gathering their own forces, their gaseous balls exploded in themselves and cast off parts of themselves in the forms of moons and satellites, holding to them as parents hold their children, their umbilical cords, the magnetic attraction between them. I'm tired tonight. Exhausting experience. I am now being shown many asteroids or very dark planets between Mars and Jupiter, some with life forms lesser or equivalent to ours. I am given the feeling that where there are great gaseous areas, swirling vortices of increasing velocity, that these new worlds in formation, and that an intelligence or directing force inconceivable to us is behind this incessant act of creation. Now I suddenly see projected to a point where I feel I can see Jupiter itself, a spectacle beyond description. It looks like it's bulged in the middle of its gigantic ball-like shape. It is a gaseous mass of myriad colors, yellow, red, ultraviolet, some greens, like a giant fireworks display. There must be chemical elements involved beyond my understanding. A huge red mass is moving across the face of Jupiter from right to left, followed by a darker cloud of immense size. It is an elongation that stretches for miles and miles, a swirling mass as though generated and added to by eruptive magnetic and gaseous forces coming from the interior of Jupiter, which seems more liquid or vaporous than solid. Strange, I can see ice crystals. They are shimmering like trillions of silver needles, and I am wondering if they are not icy cold. They seem to be near the surface. I wish I could see through the enormous cloud cover, which must be miles deep. It billows and leaps with a changing vivid yellow and red and green incandescence, as though reflecting great magnetic fires of some source. Now I suddenly seem to see through and catch light of a reddish-brown formation, extending in a curved line as far as my mind's eye can see. Can it be Jupiter's Earth crust? It looks almost metallic, molten in sparks, red-hot, great vapors seething through. It gives me a dizzy sensation to look at it. I wonder if Ingo is getting anything like this, or what form his impressions are taking. I don't know how close Pioneer 10 is going to come to Jupiter in its bypass, but it looks like it will encounter powerful magnetic forces, winds of terrific velocity, and gaseous masses of possible poisonous and damaging nature. The atmosphere seems unusually dense on some levels and extremely rarefied on others. There appear to be huge volcanic peaks, great cones rising some miles in area in deep frozen-looking crystal-covered valleys. There must be water, probably mostly in solidified or vaporized form. I don't get any sensation of heat or cold, and I don't hear what I see. It's like a silent movie, but I feel tired, somewhat sapped of energy. I am conscious of my body. I notice the back of my hands are bright red and flushed with blood. I have not observed this reaction before. I have to collect my senses. I have a strong, heavy sensation like waking up from a sleep with a faraway feeling. Martha is calling me. Ingo is on the phone. There's a planet with stripes. I hope it's Jupiter. I think that it must have an extremely large hydrogen mantle. If a space probe made contact with that, it would be maybe 80,000 to 120,000 miles out from the planet's surface. So I'm approaching it on the tangent, where I can see it's a half moon. In other words, half lit, half dark. If I move around to the lit side, it's distinctly yellow toward the right. Very high in the atmosphere, there are crystals. They glitter. Maybe the stripes are like bands of crystals. Maybe like rings of Saturn, though not far out like that, very close within the atmosphere. I bet you they'll reflect radio probes. Is that possible if you had a cloud of crystals that were assaulted by different radio waves? Now they'll go down through. It feels really good there. I said that before, didn't I? Inside these cloud layers, those crystal layers, they look beautiful from the outside. From the inside, they look like roiling gas clouds. Eerie yellow light, rainbows. I get the impression, though I don't see, that it's liquid. Then I came through the cloud cover. The surface, it looks like sand dunes. They're made of very large grade crystals, so they slide. Tremendous winds, sort of like maybe the prevailing winds of Earth, but very close to the surface of Jupiter. From that view, the horizon looks orangish or rose-colored, but overhead it's kind of greenish yellow. If I look to the right, there's an enormous mountain range. If I'm giving a description of where I've gone and am, it would be approximately where Alaska is if the sun were directly overhead, which it is. The sun looks like it has a green corona. White. I feel there is liquid somewhere. Those mountains are very huge, but they still don't poke up through the crystal cloud cover. You know, I had a dream once of something like this, where the cloud cover was a great arc, sweeps over the entire heaven. Those grains which make that sand orange are quite large. They have a polished surface, and they look something like amber, of like obsidian, but they're yellowish and not as heavy. The wind blows them, they slide along. If I turn, the whole thing seems enormously flat. I mean, if I get the feeling that if a man stood on those sands, I think he would sink into them. Maybe that's where the liquid feeling comes from. I see something that looks like a tornado. Is there a thermal inversion here? I bet there is. I bet you that the surface of Jupiter will give a very high infrared count reading. The heat is held down. I seem to be stuck, not moving. I'll move more towards the equator. I get the impression that that must be a band of crystals similar to the outer ones, kind of bluish. They seem to be sort of in orbit, permanent orbit, down through another layer farther down, which are like our clouds but moving fast. There's another area, liquid like water. Looks like it's got icebergs in it, but they're not icebergs. Tremendous wind. It's colder here. Maybe it's because there's not a thermal inversion there. I'm back. Okay. The first obvious difference between the descriptions given by Swan and Sherman is their tone. While Sherman seems to wax poetic and enter a state of philosophical introspection, Swan maintains a more or less matter-of-fact narrative, offering less abstruse hypotheticals about the physical nature of what he was supposedly viewing. With this in mind, it would be fair to say Swan's descriptions are somewhat more testable and more in keeping with the ultimate goal of the experiment. Still, Sherman does make a number of intelligible, unambiguous statements. Any such statements, especially those that mirror statements found within Swan's narrative, is notable and should be given a modicum of scrutiny. Sherman begins with a lengthy account of one of Jupiter's moons, likely one of the 4 large Galilean moons, as he describes it as larger than Earth. This is not an accurate statement, as neither Io, Europa, Callisto, nor Ganymede, which is indeed the largest moon in the entire solar system, are anywhere near this size. It is interesting that Sherman describes the unnamed moon as a great shiny ball with crystal-like diamond sparkles, which would be an apt description if referring to one of Jupiter's numerous icy satellites. Photographic instrumentation on the Pioneer 10 probe is more or less a mechanical analog of the human eye, and it is very unlikely the albedo of any body in the vicinity of Jupiter, including Jupiter itself, would be so blinding that physical eyesight could not stand it. And in regards to Pioneer 10, Sherman states that the probe will ultimately be destroyed if its course is not altered. This is obviously incorrect, as the probe is currently traveling through interstellar space toward the star Aldebaran, having successfully performed a pre-planned gravity assist maneuver as it passed the giant planet. Sherman relays an impression that Jupiter itself has 17 moons. This is wildly inaccurate. As of 2024, Jupiter has no less than 95. Weirdly, Sherman also surmised at least some of the Jovian moons were spawned by the convulsive volcanic action in the interior of the giant planet. This idea echoes a set of rather unusual theories put forth by Russian-American psychoanalyst Immanuel Velikovsky, whose writings enjoyed a brief surge in popularity during the early 1970s. Among other things, Velikovsky posited that the planet Venus had once been ejected by Jupiter via some process of material fission and sent hurtling around the solar system, causing a number of events observed within the ancient world. There is no reason to believe Sherman was attempting to plagiarize Velikovsky's unusual ideas, but noting his predilection toward esoteric subjects, it is highly likely he was aware of them. Paradoxically, as Sherman seems to be moving away from the intended target, we are treated to an observation of what are apparently asteroids within the main asteroid belt between Mars and Jupiter, which in all probability are the remains of a long since destroyed or malformed planet. Sherman explicitly states some of these dark planets are inhabited by life forms lesser or equivalent to ours. This is exceedingly unlikely and was an odd claim to make in April of 1973, as Pioneer 10 had already passed through and exited the belt 2 months prior, never once detecting evidence of life, primitive or otherwise. Sherman's initial description of Jupiter is accurate, if somewhat ornamental. The planet is essentially a colorful gaseous mass that bulges noticeably along its equator. This bulge is due to high centrifugal forces, as the planet completes one rotation in just under 10 hours. The huge red mass Sherman describes is undoubtedly referring to the famous Great Red Spot, visible within Jupiter's atmosphere. The spot has been telescopically studied since the early 19th century, and has undoubtedly been seen since the 1600s, as evidenced by the 1711 painting by Bolognese artist Donato Creti. The spot is indeed a swirling mass, essentially a giant hurricane, and could be said to be partially driven by gaseous forces, although the involvement of magnetism is doubtful. Interestingly, Sherman describes the interior of Jupiter to be more liquid or vaporous than solid. It is currently theorized that the enormous pressures and heat within the Jovian atmosphere have created a planetary core made of metallic hydrogen, a strange state of matter in which the ordinarily colorless and odorless gas becomes a semi-liquid alkali metal. Later, Sherman wonders if he is seeing Jupiter's Earth crust and describes it as metallic. The core would indeed effectively comprise Jupiter's surface, akin to the crust of the Earth. He goes on to predict that Pioneer 10 would face powerful magnetic force and great winds of both dense and rarefied nature. Although the probe did encounter Jupiter's respectable magnetic field, intense radiation negatively affected its imaging systems, it never entered the atmosphere and never encountered winds in the normal sense. Sherman closes with an observation of huge volcanic peaks, great cones rising some miles, and deep frozen crystal-covered valleys. Presumably, he is still referring to Jupiter, which would make these statements incompatible with those immediately preceding it. But, being charitable, one could consider the supposedly imprecise nature of remote viewing, especially Sherman's own brand of to-and-fro meanderings, and surmise he is observing Jupiter's third-largest moon, Io, which orbits only about 250,000 miles from the gas giant. Due to tidal forces, Io is the most volcanically active body in the solar system, with many of its peaks reaching heights far above those found on Earth. The largest, named Buusel Montes, is over 57,000 feet tall, roughly twice the size of Mount Everest. The moon is so active that it has likely recycled its entire surface numerous times. It is also covered in silicates and various sulfurous compounds, much of which is crystalline. Sherman's claims, if they are indeed about Io, are even more eyebrow-raising if we consider the fact that volcanism was not discovered on the moon until an observation made by the Voyager 1 probe in 1979. As noted, Swan is much more straightforward and linear in his viewing, immediately focusing on the center of the Jovian system, Jupiter itself, although to be fair, he seems a bit unsure of his location, which does not bode well for a man who claims to be able to transport his mind over vast distances. Nevertheless, Swan's initial description is not out of bounds, as the giant planet indeed has a large hydrogen mantle and a striking striped atmosphere, which probably contains a sizable proportion of ammonium hydrosulfide crystals, although these are not likely the cause of Jupiter's banded appearance. The atmosphere is comprised mostly of hydrogen and helium, which are in fact transparent to radio waves, though as Puthoff confirms, clouds of microscopic crystals could be reflective. Swan mentions something being liquid, though exactly what isn't clear. This, along with directly successive statements, is strange when compared to Sherman's observations. Whatever could be deemed a surface on Jupiter is certainly not made of nor covered with crystals, the presence of which seems to be a peculiar fixation of Swan's, as is the term gaseous for Sherman. Could Swan be describing Io? Like Sherman, Swan's descriptions, with its crystalline valleys and enormous mountains, speak of features widely found on the relatively close moon. In this case, Swan's unadorned narrative actually works against him, as he never states he is traveling to a nearby object or leaving the planet's surface for the remainder of his time. If anything, Swan seems to be playing it safe by not going too far afield, as if he is standing or floating in a stationary position, describing what he sees from a fixed vantage point. Immediately following his session, Swan drew a diagram to help explain his vision to the SRI team, which depicted whirlwinds of crystals close to the surface and a quite large chain of mountains to the east, 30,000 feet high. Clearly, Swan thought he was on Jupiter. It is also clear, considering Pioneer 10 telemetry, he was mistaken. Practically all of the information given by both Sherman and Swan is likely less the result of ESP than informed guesses. Information about astronomical objects was not hard to come by in the 1970s for anyone with a library card and a high school education. Popular media was starting to steer away from the whimsical weirdness of George Pal to the rock-ribbed realism of Kubrick, making it difficult to distinguish what the average person imagines from what he or she physically sees. Still, Sherman's description of what could be viewed as Jupiter's volcanic moon, something not known to science until several years later, is genuinely intriguing, as are his descriptions of a metallic surface. It is possible that both Sherman and by extension Swan were relaying a broad mixture of actual remotely viewed images and imaginative figments. It is also possible they had simply made good guesses and are not actually psychic. It is worth noting that on March 11, 1974, Swan and Sherman repeated their extraterrestrial adventure, this time targeting the planet Mercury, which was due to be visited by the Mariner 10 probe. This particular session was neither conducted nor observed by SRI staff, but was intended to yield less ambiguous results, as far less was known scientifically about Mercury than Jupiter. The results of the session were not particularly remarkable. Despite the best efforts of SRI researchers, the question of clairvoyance endured, and SCANATE's objectives remained unfulfilled. A new, much more rigorous series of experiments would be designed, and new test subjects would be procured over the next several weeks.